She hadn't thing left. No husband. No actually name worth speaking in polite company. No place at any table in town. The women crossed the street when they saw her coming. The men, looked through her like glass. She had learned to live on the edges of everything. The edge of the settlement, the edge of the forest, the edge of other people's lives, and she had told herself more than once that the edges were fine. The edges were enough. But the river didn't care about edges. It came down from the mountains that spring like something alive, and furious, swallowing the banks whole, tearing roots from the earth, carrying whole trees in its arms like they weighed nothing at all. The settlers stayed inside and listened to it roar. They pressed their faces to fogged windows and shook their heads, and thank God they were not out in it. She was out in it. Not because she was brave. Not because she was looking for anything. She was out in it because she was always out in it. Because there was no warm hearth waiting for her, no table set with her name, no voice calling her home from the cold. She moved through the rain like she moved through her life. Head down, alone, doing what needed doing. And then she saw him. A man, plus half submerged, his hands locked around the broken end of a cottonwood branch, the river doing everything in its power to take him from it. His face was turned up to the sky, eyes barely open, and the water was winning. She did look, not stop to think about what kind of man he was, or where he came from, or what the people in town would say. She had long since stopped making decisions based on what the people in town would say. She pulled off her coat, tied her rope to the nearest solid thing she could find, and went in. That is where this story begins. Plus, not with the rescue, though the rescue was real, and it was close, and it cost her something she would carry in her body for the rest of her life. It begins with a choice. A woman the world had decided was worth nothing, choosing to fight the river for a man the world had decided was worth less. And neither of them would ever be the same. Her name was Eliza Pruitt, though most people in the town of Cowlowell, Missouri had stopped using it somewhere around the time her husband died. After that, she became the widow, or worse, depending on who's talking. She had been 26 years old when Thomas Pruitt put a pistol to his own temple in the barn behind their house. And she had been blamed for it in every way people could think to blame a woman without actually saying the words out loud. The way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she had never been soft enough, warm enough, yielding enough. It was whispered, actually, that she had driven him to it, that a better wife would have saved him, that a woman like Eliza, proud, quiet, unbending, was the kind of woman who broke men rather than kept them. Basically, she had stopped arguing. Not because she believed any of it, but because argument required an audience that was willing to listen, and Cowlowell wasn't that kind of town. She kept the small plot of land at the north end of the settlement, the one nobody else wanted because of how close it sat to the river. She, I think, grew what she could, and she traded what she grew for what she couldn't: flour, lamp oil, thread. She kept 2 chickens and a half-blind mule named Ezra, who was the most consistent relationship in her life. She did not go to church. She did not attend socials. She did not accept charity, because charity in Cowlowell always came with a cost she had learned not to pay. She wasn't unhappy, exactly. She was something, to be fair, more complicated than unhappy. She was a woman who had made a kind of peace with invisibility, who had built something small and survivable out of the wreckage of other people's judgments. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was hers, and no one could take it. The spring of 1847 brought rain that didn't know when to stop. It started in early March as the kind of soft, patient rain that the farmers welcomed, soaking into dry soil, filling the creek beds, promising a good planting season. By the second week, it had turned into something else. Heavy and relentless, drumming on every roof in Cowlowell day and night, turning the roads to mud, and making the river, which was already running fast from snow melt in the hills, into a living, churning, brown-gray thing that climbed its banks inch by inch every morning. By the third week of March, the river was angry. Eliza could hear it from her house, which she had grown so accustomed to its sound over the years, the low, constant rush of it, the occasional slap of water against the larger stones, that she measured its moods the way other people measured weather. She knew when it was content and when it was restless. She knew when it was merely running hard and when it was genuinely dangerous. That third kind of week, it was dangerous, and she kept her distance from the bank, and she brought Ezra into the small lean-to attached to the house, so the old mule wouldn't spook in the night and wander too close to the edge. She wasn't afraid of the river, but she respected it. That was a distinction she thought about more than most people would understand. The morning of March 22nd, she woke before dawn to a sound she hadn't heard before, a deep, bass groaning that seemed to come from somewhere inside the earth itself. She pulled on her boots and her coat and went outside into the rain, and she stood there in the gray pre-dawn light and listened, and after a moment she understood. Something upstream had given way. A log jam, maybe. For what it's worth, section of eroded bank. Whatever it was, it had released a surge of water into the river that was now moving downstream toward Kowloon like a slow-rolling fist. She walked to the edge of the tree line along the north bank, not close to the water, but close enough to see it. The river had honestly swollen another 2 feet overnight. It was the color of clay, turbid and thick with the things it had swallowed. Branches, debris, the occasional bobbing shape of something she didn't want to look at too closely. The sound of it was no longer a rush. It was a roar, a grinding, sort of continuous roar like the sound of something enormous eating. She stood there for a while, watching. She kind of couldn't have said why. There was nothing she could do about the river. She, I guess, had no reason to be there except that the river was doing something she had never seen it do before, and she was a woman who paid attention to the world whether the world paid attention to her or not. That was when she saw the branch, which it was a large cottonwood limb, maybe 15 feet long, carving through the center of the current with the river pushing hard against it. And there was something on it. She thought first it was an animal, a deer, maybe caught in the flood. But I think then the shape moved and shifted, and she saw hands. Human hands, locked around the broken base of the branch where it had snapped from the trunk, knuckles white even from this distance. A man. There was a man in the river. She did not scream. She did not, stand there calculating odds or making moral arguments with herself. The part of her brain that had learned to hesitate, to check first what others might think, to measure the cost of any action against the social calculus of Kowloon. That part went quiet. Something older and simpler took over. She was already moving. She ran, back to the house for the coil of rope she kept on the inside wall near the door. She looped one end around the largest oak at the edge of the clearing, a tree she trusted because she had watched it stand through 15 years of storms, and she wrapped the other end twice around her right wrist and grabbed it with both hands, and then she went down the bank toward the water. The river wasn't cold the way cold water is cold in a glass. It was cold the way stone is cold in winter, a cold that went past sensation and became something else entirely, something that locked around her chest like a vice and stopped her breath for a moment when she stepped in. The current grabbed her immediately, not hard enough to take her off her feet, but hard enough to make her feel how easily it could. The mud under her boots was unstable. Every step was a negotiation. Plus, she moved upstream along the bank, keeping the rope taut behind her, putting herself in the path of where the cottonwood branch would pass. The man on the branch was closer now. She could actually see him clearly. Dark hair plastered flat against his head, face turned up to the rain, one side of his face dark with blood where something had opened a cut above his temple. His eyes were barely open. He had the look of a man who had been fighting for a long time and was running out of fight. She waited until the branch was close enough. Then she lunged. Plus, she got one hand on the branch and nearly went under. The current punched into her like a wall. The rope went rigid behind her, biting into her wrist hard enough that she felt it in her shoulder, and for one terrible second she was simply held there. The river pulling her one way, the rope holding her the other, the branch between her hands shaking with the force of the water. She pulled. She set her feet in the mud and pulled with everything she had, pulling the branch toward the bank, pulling the man on it with her, and the river pushed back with a kind of mindless, enormous fury that hadn't anything personal in it, which almost made it worse. She was screaming, which she didn't realize it until later. Not from fear, but from effort, the kind of sound that comes out of a body when it is using every muscle it has and needs more. She pulled, and she braced, and she pulled again, and slowly, fighting the river for every inch, she dragged the branch sideways toward the shallower water near the bank. The man was conscious enough to help. When the branch swung closer to shore, he shifted his weight, moved his hands, tried to get his feet under him. He went under once completely. She felt the branch jump as his grip broke, and she thought for one sick moment that she had lost him. But then his hands were back, and he was coughing river water, and she pulled again. They came out of the river together. Pretty much not gracefully. Not like something from a painting, which they came out the way things come out of rivers, crawling, gasping, covered in mud, on their hands and knees on the bank. She collapsed on her side in the wet grass. Her wrist was already swelling where the rope had cut into it. Her lungs felt like they had been wrung out. She could hear the river still roaring behind her, entirely indifferent to what had just happened, still moving downstream toward Cal Lowell, carrying its debris and its noise and its cold. The man was Amin beside her. He was breathing. That was the thing she focused on first. He was breathing. Ragged, broken-sounding breaths, but breaths. She pushed herself up on her knees and looked at him. He was Choctaw. She could see that clearly. The broad, angular face, the dark eyes that were now open and fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read. He was a large man, broad-shouldered under his soaked clothing, which was a mix of traditional dress and the kind of practical frontier clothing that moved between worlds. The cut on his temple was still bleeding, running a thin red line down his cheek and dripping from his jaw. He was shaking, not with cold only, though the cold was real, but with the particular shaking a body that has just asked more of itself than it had and barely gotten through. He said something. She didn't understand the words. She shook her head. He said it again, in English this time, though it cost him visible effort to switch. "You pulled me out." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the river. Then back at her. There was something kind of working in his face, some complicated interior process that she didn't push at. "My name is Neshoba," he said finally. "TBH, Eliza Pruitt," she said. "Can you walk?" He tested it. He got one knee up, then the other, and she put a hand under his arm to steady him, and he stood unsteady, his legs clearly threatening to give out, but standing. He was a full head taller than her. She came up to his shoulder. "My camp," he said. "Upstream. Quarter mile, maybe more, which I don't know now." "Not today," she said. "Come to the house first. Get warm." He looked at her. The expression was still unreadable. Not suspicious exactly, but careful. A pretty much man who had learned the cost of accepting things from strangers. "I don't need, you're bleeding from your head, and you were in that river for God knows how long," she said. "You TBH need to sit down and get warm before you go anywhere. After that you can do whatever you like." He didn't argue again. He followed, I guess, her up the bank and through the clearing to the house, walking slowly, one hand occasionally touching a tree or fence post for balance. She didn't offer her arm again. He hadn't taken it the first time, and she understood the refusal. A man like him in a place like this did not lean on strangers, especially not white women from settlements. Well, the calculation wasn't complicated. Inside the house, she got the fire going in the stone hearth. It had burned down low overnight, and she put water on a boil, and she set a blanket on the chair nearest the fire, and she did not fuss at him about sitting in it or tell him he should. She just set TBH it there and went about the practical work of heating the house, and after a moment he sat down. She cleaned the cut on his temple with boiled water and a strip of clean linen. He sat still for it. His face gave nothing away. Not the hiss she expected when she pressed the cloth against the wound. Not a flinch. Not any of the small performances of stoicism men usually offer to let you know they were being stoic. He simply sat well, still, the way a person sits still when they've decided that this is the necessary thing, and there's no point in making more of it. "How did you end up in a river?" she asked, working carefully around the cut. "My horse slipped." "On the bank," he said. "Upstream." She made it out. "I didn't. Where are you from?" A pause. "Honestly, I travel," he said. "My family is south. I was passing through." She didn't push. The year was 1847. She knew what that meant for a Choctaw man traveling through Missouri. The removal had happened less than a decade ago. That forced march west that the Choctaw called the Trail of Tears and Death, and the ones who remained or returned existed in a scene that had been deliberately made unwelcoming for them. A man who said he traveled and offered nothing more about where he was from or where he was going had reasons for that economy of information. She tied off the bandage, which she handed him a tin cup of hot water with some dried herbs she kept for illness. Not tea exactly, but warming, and it would help with the shaking. He took it with both hands and held it. The rain basically was still coming down outside. Plus, the fire was going. The house was small, one room, essentially with a sleeping partition at the back separated by a hanging cloth, but it was dry, and it was warm, and after the river those two things felt enormous. "You live alone here," he said. It wasn't a question, yes. "The town doesn't," he stopped. "The town doesn't have much use for me," she said. "That's mutual." He looked at her then, with a different expression, something that was almost recognition. She had seen that look before, though never from Choctaw Man. She had seen it from other people who lived on the outside edges of things. The look that said, "I understand something about that." Actually not the same thing, but something, and he stayed through the morning. She didn't ask him to, and she didn't ask him to leave. She went, I think, about her work, feeding the chickens, checking on Ezra, doing the small maintenance tasks. That kept a one-woman homestead running, and he sat by the fire and gradually stopped shaking. At some point, she heated cornmeal and dried venison into something close to a meal and set a bowl on the table, and he came to the table and ate without ceremony, and she ate too, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. By midday, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the river was still high, but had stopped climbing. "I should go back," he said. "My horse." "I'll walk part of the way with you," she said. "The bank is unstable. You don't know where it's safe." He looked at her for a moment with that careful, measuring expression. Then he nodded. They walked north along the edge of the tree line, close enough to the bank to see the river, but far enough back to be on solid ground. Eliza knew every yard of the stretch, where the roots held the soil, and where they didn't, where the ground looked solid but would give underweight, where the deer trails cut close to the water. She moved through it without hesitation, and she could feel him watching the way she moved, noting it. They found his horse half a mile upstream, standing in a stand of young birch trees, wet and unhappy but unharmed, a gray mare with a dark mane. She greeted Neshoba with the particular relief of an animal that has spent several hours certain its person was gone forever. He checked her legs, her hooves, her breathing, running his hands down her sides with the focused attention of a man who knew horses deeply and trusted that knowledge completely. "She's all right," Eliza said, watching. "Yes." He stood and looked at her. "Eliza Pruitt." "Yes. You went into that river for me." "I did." "You didn't know me." "No." He was quiet for a moment. The gray mare nosed at his shoulder. "In my language," he said slowly, as if choosing the words carefully, "there's a thing we say when someone does something for you that they had no reason to do. There isn't a word for it in English exactly. It means kind of you're a person who sees people." He paused. Not everyone does that. She didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't accustomed to being seen, let alone told that she was. She looked at the ground, at the wet grass, at the roots of the birch trees. "I hope your journey south goes well," she said finally. "I'll come back this way," he said, "when the river is down." She looked up at him. There wasn't a thing in his expression of the empty social promise people made, the ill-see around that meant the opposite. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, as a statement of fact. "All right," she said. She walked back alone along the river's edge, the drizzle soft on her face, the river still high and loud beside her. Her wrist ached. Her legs ached. Plus, she was cold in the particular deep way of someone who has been very cold and is only partway back from it. She went into the house and stoked the fire and sat in the chair closest to it, and she sat there for a long time, looking at the blanket she had put there for him, which was still slightly damp from his wet clothes. She pretty much did not let herself think too much about what she felt. She had gotten good at that over the years, at keeping the distance between feeling and analysis, at not examining things too closely in case what she found was something she couldn't easily put back in its box. But sitting there in the warmth and the rain quiet of the house, she was aware of something she hadn't felt in a long time, something simple and small and difficult to name. The sensation of having mattered. She had pulled a man out of a river, not because anyone told her to, not because there was something in it for her, not because the people of Kowloon were watching and would think better of her for it. She had done it because he was there and he was drowning, and that was enough. and like he had looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "You are a person who sees people." Outside, the river was beginning very slowly to fall. She put more wood on the fire. She wound a rope that had cut her wrist and hung it back on the wall where it lived. She did not know if Neshoba would come back. She did not know what it would mean if he did, or what the people of Kowloon would say look about it if they found out. And they'd find out because they always did. She found, for the first time in a long time, that she did not care very much what the people of Kowloon would say. She slept that night better than she had in months. He came back 16 days later. The river had fallen back to something close to its normal level, though it was still running faster than it should have been for the season, still cloudy with the sediment it had stirred from the bottom during the flood. The banks were left with the evidence of what had passed: debris lines of broken wood and river grass and mud dried hard in the sun, the land marked at its high point like a tide mark on a wall. Eliza had spent the better part of those 16 days repairing the damage the flood had done to the north end of her property, shoring up the bank near her small garden plot with stones she had to carry from the dry creek bed, replacing the fence posts that the water had undermined and knocked sideways. She was, in my opinion, on her knees in the garden bed, pressing onion sets into soil that was still damp and heavy when she heard the horse. She knew, without looking up, there was something about the pace of it, unhurried, deliberate, the footfall of a horse whose rider wasn't in a hurry and had no reason to pretend otherwise. She pressed another set into the earth. She heard actually the horse stop. She finished the row. When she stood and turned, Neshoba was sitting on the gray mare at the edge of the clearing, watching her work with the patient. Unhurried expression she was beginning to understand was simply how he occupied the world. "The river's down," he said, by way of greeting. "3 days now," she said. "Your camp survived the flood?" "Mostly." He dismounted, easy and practiced, looping the reins loosely around the fence rail. Some things got wet. Nothing that mattered. He was different in daylight and health than he'd been on the riverbank, soaked and bleeding and barely conscious. The cut above his temple had healed to a thin, dark line. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she hadn't registered his height properly that morning, having been too focused on the practical problem of whether he was going to stay upright. He moved with a quality she found difficult to name. Not ease exactly, more the absence of unnecessary movement, as if he had at some early point decided to stop wasting motion on things that didn't require it. "I brought this," he said, holding out a bundle wrapped in cloth. She came over and took it. Inside were dried, I think, herbs she didn't recognize, dark, faintly fragrant leaves bound with cord, and a smaller packet of what looked like dried berries. She looked up at him. "For the wrist," he said. "Steep the leaves. Soak a cloth, look. It helps with the deep bruise." Her wrist was still discolored. The rope mark faded from sharp red to a blurred green-yellow under the skin. She hadn't mentioned it the morning he left. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. "I guess, thank you," she said. "You know what you're doing in the garden," he said, looking past her at the beds. "You've been here a long time." 12 years, she said. "I came out here with my husband." A pause. "He's gone." "Yes." He didn't ask how. She was grateful for that. And she made tea inside. Real tea, the last of what she'd traded for in February. And they sat at the small table by the window, and the light came in through the wavy glass in the way it did in the late morning, casting long, pale shapes across the floor. Neshoba looked at the room in the way a careful person looks at a place where another careful person lives, taking in what was there and what wasn't, reading the small decisions that made up a life. The neat stacking of supplies, the rope on the wall, plus the 2 chairs, one slightly more worn than the other. The shelf with the 3 books, one of which had its spine repaired with a strip of leather. The absence of anything decorative except a small river stone on the windowsill, striped gray and white, the kind children pick up because something about the pattern pleases them. "The stone," he said. She looked at it. "I basically found it the year I came here. I kept it." He nodded slowly, as if this explained something he had already suspected. They talked, that first return visit, in the way that people talk when they are not yet sure of the ground between them, but are willing to test it. Carefully, leaving space. He told her he had been traveling since the fall, moving through the country on a route that took him through places his father had known, places he was trying to hold in his memory against the erosion of time and displacement. His sort of family was in Indian territory now, the land the government had driven them to after the removal, his mother, 2 sisters, his mother's brother who was old and not well. He sent money when he could. He came back east when the season allowed it, for reasons he described as practical, but which she suspected were something older and more personal. She told him things she hadn't told anyone in years. Not everything. She wasn't a woman who poured herself out all at once, but things that she had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and had been educated in the particular way that educated women of her generation were. Enough to be curious, not enough to be inconvenient. That she had married Thomas Pruitt at 19 because it had seemed like the right thing to do, and because he had been funny and attentive, and she hadn't yet learned to distinguish between a man who was genuinely alive and a man who was brilliant at performing aliveness. That she had followed him west because he had needed to go west, and that she had built a life here in the 12 years since because this was where she was, and she wasn't a woman who stopped building. She didn't tell him about the barn. She didn't tell him what Thomas had done. But she thought, from the way he listened, that he understood something had happened that she wasn't saying, and that he had decided the space around it was hers to keep. He came back the next week. Plus, and the week after that, it developed the way things develop between two people who have both been careful for a long time. Not in a rush, not with declarations or performances, but in the accumulation of small, ordinary things. He helped her carry the large stones for the bank reinforcement that she hadn't been able to move alone. She showed him where the best wild onions grew in the tree line to the east. He told her the names of things in Choctaw, the river, the sky, the particular shade of green that the new oak leaves made in the first weeks of spring, and she repeated them carefully and remembered them, which seemed to matter to him. He had a dry, very quiet sense of humor that took her 2 or 3 visits to notice, because it came out in the form of very slight changes of expression rather than anything so obvious as a smile, and because the things he found funny were never the things she expected. The first time she made him laugh, really laugh, not just that small shift of expression, but an actual open sound, was when Ezra, the half-blind mule, walked directly into the fence post he had been standing next to for 11 years, apparently having forgotten it existed, and stood looking confused at the post, as if it had moved. "He does that," she said. "And how old is he?" "Nobody knows. He was old when Thomas bought him." Neshoba looked at Ezra with an expression that was, she thought, the closest thing to genuine affection she had seen on his face, which was an interesting thing to feel jealous of, being a mule. "He doesn't let his blindness stop him," Neshoba said. "It doesn't seem to embarrass him either," she said. And Neshoba laughed, and it was such an unexpected and complete sound that she found herself laughing too, and for a moment there in the yard with the mule looking indignant, and the spring sun coming through the new leaves, the weight of everything, the judgment of the town, the years of quiet and invisibility, the specific grief of a life built on the ruins of other people's choices, lifted slightly, the way a heavy door lifts when you find a right angle. She had forgotten that. She, in my opinion, had forgotten how much lighter the world could be, briefly, in the company of someone who found the same things funny as you did. It wasn't, I guess, she told herself firmly, romantic, which she was a practical woman. She understood, kind of, the realities of their situation clearly. A white widow woman and a Choctaw man in Missouri in 1847 occupied 2 different kinds of social invisibility. If their friendship became visible to the town, the consequences would fall harder on him than on her. She had already sacrificed her reputation to Callowell's judgment and was beyond further damage. He hadn't and shouldn't be asked to, but it was something she didn't have a word for, a kind of warmth that hadn't thing to do with the hearth, a quality of being in the same space with someone and finding that the space felt different because of it, better somehow, more real. She thought about what he had said the day he left. "You are a person who sees people." Plus, she had, I guess, been thought of in this town as cold, as difficult, as a woman who looked at things too directly and didn't bother softening her eyes when she did it. It had never occurred to her that looking directly at things could be reframed as a gift. One afternoon in late April she asked him, because she needed to understand it, what the removal had been like. She asked it plainly, because she only knew how to ask things plainly, and because she thought the worst thing she could do was pretend the question was smaller than it was. He was quiet for a long time. They were sitting on the bank, not the dangerous section near her property. The wider, gentler stretch half a mile south where the river slowed and the water was clear over white stones. He was watching the water. "My grandmother died on the trail," he said finally. She was 61 years old, and she had never been sick. She had buried a husband and 2 children, and she had never once been broken by it. She walked, I guess, for 45 days in the winter cold with shoes that weren't made for walking, and she made it most of the way. He stopped. She was 3 days from where they were taking us when she sat down and didn't get up again. Eliza didn't say she was sorry. The words felt inadequate in a way that insulted both of them. She sat with it instead. "The soldiers," he said. "Some of them were ashamed. You could see it. They knew what they were doing was wrong, and they did it anyway because they had orders and because the law said it was legal and because what's legal and what's right are 2 different things, and most people, when the pressure comes, follow what's legal." He paused. "Your country has a talent for making evil things legal." "Yes," she said. "You didn't do those things," he said. "I know that. I'm not saying you did." "I know," she said. "But I live in a country that did." He looked at her. "So do I," he said. "That's, well, the thing, isn't it? And we both live here. In the same country that has treated us both differently, not the same, I'm not saying the same. Treated us both basically as people who don't quite fit the shape it wants us to fit." She thought about that for a long time after he left that day. About the difference between her outsideness and his, the incomparable difference, the way hers was a matter of social judgment, and his was a matter of survival, of law, of a government that had decided his people shouldn't exist in their homeland. She wasn't going to be the kind of woman who flattened that distinction, who reached for false equivalence as a way of making her own pain more comfortable. But she was also going to sit with the truth of what he had said. That 2 kind of people could be in different ways and to vastly different degrees people the world had decided to make invisible, and that the recognition of that between 2 such people was its own strange and unexpected gift. He had begun bringing things when he came. Not gifts in the formal sense. He wasn't a man who performed gestures, but practical things. A brace of rabbits from the trap lines he ran upstream. Wild ginger root from a place he knew along the eastern ridge. Once a small knife with a bone handle, which he set on her table without explanation, and she understood was for her because the one she had been using had a blade that was going loose. She began to leave things for him, which not food. He didn't need her to feed him, but small practical things she thought he might use. Extra candles, once, because he had mentioned his camp had poor light for the evenings. A length of waterproof oilcloth she had no use for. Once, because she sort of couldn't help herself, the second of her 3 books, a worn copy of, a collection of essays she had read 4 times and could read again from memory. She left it on the fence rail with a note that said only, "I thought you might like this one." He came back 2 days later with the book and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. "I read it in one night," he said. "You don't have to give it back." "I finished it," he said. "I want to be fair, talk about it." And they did. For 3 hours, sitting in the late afternoon light on the porch she had built with her own hand from timber salvaged after the flood, they talked about the essays, about the arguments in them, the ones they agreed with and the ones they didn't, the ideas that made them angry and the ones that made them feel less alone. He was the most thoughtful reader she had ever talked to. He, didn't defer to the author's authority. He argued with the text as if the author were there and could hear him, which was exactly the way Eliza's father had taught her to read, and which she had never found in another person in 12 years of frontier life. When he left that evening, she stood on the porch and watched him ride north along the riverbank until the trees took him, and she was aware of something shifting in her chest, something that had been locked in one position for a very long time beginning, slowly, and with some resistance, to turn. She did not name it, and she wasn't ready to name it. But she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a season changing, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small things, the angle of the light, the temperature of the air in the morning, the particular smell of things waking up after a long time of being still. In town, things were beginning to be noticed. She had known they'd be eventually. The woman at the dry goods store, a narrow-faced woman named Mrs. Ackert, who had been the leading voice of Eliza's social exile for 6 years, had looked at her strangely during her last trade visit, had asked, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere close to her eyes, whether Eliza was expecting company out on her land. Eliza had said no and bought her flour and left. But she knew what it meant. Kowloon had eyes everywhere, and someone had seen Neshoba's horse at her fence, or seen the two of them walking along the riverbank, or simply noticed the absence of her usual solitude. She wasn't naive about what was coming, and she had lived in this town long enough to know exactly how it would go, and she knew that it would be worse for him than for her. And she lay awake one night, turning that knowledge over and over, trying to find a shape of what was right to do with it. She did not consider ending the friendship. She was finished making decisions based on what Kowloon wanted. She had lost enough to that calculation, but she was honestly going to have to think carefully about what came next. And she was going to have to, at some point, tell him what she knew was coming so that the decision about how to face it could be his as well as hers. She fell asleep with the fire low and the spring peepers singing outside in the dark, and she thought, he said he wouldn't forget her. She had believed him in the way you believe someone when the words come out of their mouth, already worn smooth with being true, already certain, already past the point where they need to be decided. She was TBH, beginning to understand what it meant to believe someone like that. She hadn't believed anyone that way in a very long time. The river moved outside, lower now, quieter, carrying its cold water south toward places she would never go. She slept. The TBH, trouble came on a Tuesday, because trouble rarely had the decency to arrive on a dramatic day. Eliza was in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horses, more than one, moving with the particular purposeful pace of men who had decided what they were going to do before they got there. She set the axe down. She waited. There were 3 of them. She knew 2 by name. Aldous Hurt, who ran the feed store and sat on the informal council of men who made decisions in Kowloon without having any official authority to make them, and his son, a heavy young man named Carl who had grown up watching his father decide things and had inherited the habit. The third man she knew by sight, one of the Brain brothers, big and broad and wearing the look of someone who had been recruited rather than had opinions of his own. Hurt pulled up, I guess, his horse at the edge of her clearing, and did not get down, which was the specific variety of rudeness that told you everything about how a man thought of himself relative to the person he was visiting. Eliza, he said. Mr. Hurt, she said. She did not offer more than that. I'll be direct with you, he said, in the tone of a man who found directness agreeable because he was the one wielding it. There's been talk. Honestly, there's always talk, she said. This is different talk. He shifted in the saddle. People have seen that Indian on your land. More than once, and coming and going like he's got a right to be here. He's a friend, she said, and he does have a right to be here. This is my land. Hurt looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected mild compliance and was mildly irritated at the absence of it. Now, Eliza, I'm not here to tell you your business. I'm here to tell you what people are saying. I know what people are saying, she said. I've known for 2 weeks, and is there something specific you'd like to say, Mr. Hurt? Or did you ride out here to tell me about a thing I already know? Carl shifted on his horse. The Brain brother looked at the ground. Hurt set his jaw. He's Choctaw. Yes. These are not people who have good relations with this settlement. These are people, she said, who have very good reasons to have bad relations with this settlement, given that this settlement exists on land that was theirs. That's a different thing from what you said. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that occurs when a man has come prepared for a type of conversation and finds himself in a different one. There are people in this town, Hurt said, his voice shifting slightly, taking on the texture of a warning, who feel that the situation is inappropriate. A widow woman, alone on her land, keeping regular company with, I saved his life, she said. A pause. Pulled him out of the river during the flood. He was drowning, which I tied a rope to that oak tree there, and went in after him and pulled him out because he was a human being who was drowning, and I was there. Since then, he has come to visit, and we've talked, and he has helped me with work on this property. We've had tea and talked about books, and I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Hurt, that I have no intention of stopping any of that because of what people in Kowloon feel about it. She watched Hurt's face move through several things in quick succession. Surprise at being pretty much answered directly was one of them. Something harder was underneath it. You know, this TBH, town has been good to you, he said. She almost laughed. She did not. Mr. Hurt, this town has been the opposite of good to me since the day Thomas died, and we both know it. I have asked nothing from Kowloon. I have accepted nothing from Kowloon. I have lived on the edge of this settlement, and kept to myself, and troubled no one, and I'll continue to do so. But you don't get to tell me who I may speak to on my own land. Hurt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his son, and at the brain brother, and then back at her. I'd advise you to think carefully, he said, about the situation. I've thought very carefully, she said. Was there anything else? He left. They all left, the 3 horses turning and heading back down toward the settlement road. And she stood in the yard and watched them go. And she wasn't shaking. She had half expected this, had been braced for it. But she was aware, as they disappeared into the tree line, of a very particular cold anger that had been living somewhere in her chest for 6 years, and that had just, under pressure, found its shape. She picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, not because there was so much left to split, but because she needed to do something physical with her hands for a few minutes. She told Neshoba about it the next time he came. He listened without expression, seated at the table with his hands around a cup of tea, watching her face as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "Did you expect it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I knew it was coming." "And you told them that I'd no intention of changing anything, yes?" He was quiet again. Something was moving behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. She had learned over the past weeks to wait when that happened rather than try to fill the silence. "There's a thing I should tell you," he said finally. She waited. "Plus, I've been here longer than I said I'd. I told myself it was because the trap lines were good this season. That is true." A pause. "It isn't the only reason." She looked at him. "I'm not a man who is easy to know," he said. "I've been careful about that for a long time because being easy to know in this country, being easy to trust, being easy to, it hasn't always ended well." He stopped. He looked at the table, "But I find I've been less careful these last weeks." "I've noticed," she said. "Does that trouble actually you?" "No," she said. "It doesn't trouble me." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not the careful, measuring expression, not the quiet humor, but something more open, something with less armor on it. "The people in your town," he said. "What they think they see." "I know," she said. "What do you see?" She considered that. She wasn't a woman who spoke carelessly, and she had spent most of her life inside a marriage where words, chosen wrong, had consequences she carried for years. She pretty much thought about what was true and whether she was willing to say it. "I see," she said slowly. "A man who is more honest than most people I have ever known. Who doesn't waste kind of words, doesn't perform things, doesn't ask me to be smaller than I'm." She paused. "That isn't nothing. And I think, my experience, it is extremely rare." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the cup in his hands. "I told you in tea forget you," he said. "That day on the bank. I remember." "I meant it then," he said. "I mean it more now." She didn't answer that directly. She got up and poured more water into the kettle and set it on the fire, which was something she did when she needed a moment to organize herself. He basically understood this about her by now, the way she moved toward practical tasks when things got too close, and he waited. "What are you planning to do?" she said, her back to him, watching the kettle. "When the season turns." "When you go south." "I'll go south," he said. "My family needs me." A pause. "I'll come back. In the spring again." "Yes." She turned around. And the meantime?" He looked at her for a long moment. "In the meantime," he said carefully, "I'm here." It was, she thought, probably the most straightforward declaration of intent she had ever heard. It had no flourish in it, no romance novel language, no promise that exceeded what he knew to be true. He was here. He would come back. These were things he knew, and he said them. She sat back down across from him, which, all right, she said. They sat in the afternoon light and drank tea, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been turning slowly these past weeks make another small rotation towards something she was nearly ready to name. May came, and, for what it's worth, brought warm weather and more work. The garden was going well, better than she had expected after the flood damage, and she was planting extra this year, a decision she told herself was practical and entirely unrelated to the fact that she had been cooking more interesting meals lately and that someone had been eating them with her. Neshoba helped her mend the south fence, which had been listing since winter. They worked most TBH of the day on it, pulling posts, resetting them in deeper holes, tamping the earth. He worked in the way he did everything, without waste, without complaint, without the need to fill the work with talk. She actually had worked alongside men before and had always found the silence of working with another person either comfortable or strained, and had never been able to predict which it would be. With him, it was comfortable in the way that only happens with people whose silence you have earned. In the afternoon, when the fence was done and the light was getting long and gold, she brought water and they sat on the ground with their backs against the fence rails, faces tipped up to the warm light, and he said nothing for several minutes, and neither did she, and it was one of the better moments she could remember having in a very long time. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said eventually. He looked at actually her and the one who died on the trail. "You said she had never been broken. I've sort of been thinking about that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, he began to talk. Her name had been Nita. She had been the kind of woman who was the center of things without requiring the center of things to belong to her. The person everyone moved toward when something went wrong, not because she had the loudest voice or the strongest opinions, but because she had a quality of steadiness that made other people's panic easier to carry. She had been a healer in the way of her people, plants and preparation and knowledge that had been passed down through her family for generations, things she had taught Neshoba piece by piece throughout his childhood as a hedge against the world. She had laughed easily. She had told stories that went on for hours, stories with many characters and many threads that seemed to wander and then came together at the end in ways that made you realize the wandering was the point. Eliza listened to all of it. She asked questions, real questions, the kind that showed she was listening, and he answered them, and the afternoon went on, and at some point she became aware that she was watching his face as much as she was listening to his words, watching the way it changed when he talked about Nita, the way the careful armor came down, and something younger and less defended appeared. "You carry her with you," she said when he paused. "Yes. The knowledge she taught you, the way she moved through the world." "When I can," he said. "When I remember to." "You remember more than you think," she said. "I've watched you." Basically, he looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, surprise. Not theatrical surprise, but the genuine, slightly discomfited surprise of a person who has been seen more clearly than they expected. She understood that expression. She had worn it herself the first time he had seen the stone on her windowsill and known what it meant. That evening there was a knock at her door after supper. Not Neshoba. He had ridden out an hour before. The knock was sharp and deliberate, and when she opened the door, she found Mrs. Cater from the edge of town, a thin woman in her 50s with the kind of face that had been pretty once, and now carried its history in deep lines around the mouth. She wasn't one of the women who had been openly cruel to Eliza over the years. She had sort of been something slightly worse, indifferent. "Eliza," she said. She was holding a covered dish. "I wanted to bring something." Eliza looked at the dish, then at the woman, which, "May I come in?" Mrs. Cater said. She let her in. The woman came in and set the dish on the table and stood there with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the room in the same way Neshoba had looked at it the first time, though reading it differently. "I heard about all this hurt coming out here," she said. "Yes. I want you to know that not everyone in this town feels the way all this hurt feels." Eliza waited. She had learned not to interpret kindness too fast. "What you did," Mrs. Cater said, "during the flood. Pulling that man out. I heard about it. Several people heard about it." She paused. "I think it was a brave thing." "It was the right thing," Eliza said. "I'm not sure that's the same as brave." Mrs. Cater looked at her. Something shifted in her face, a kind of recognition, the look of a woman who has spent her life making certain distinctions she has never had anyone put into words before. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose not." She picked up the edge of her shawl and turned it in her fingers. "I've, in my opinion, not been a good neighbor to you, Eliza. I know that. I want to say so." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She looked at the covered dish. "There's no need to. There's actually," Mrs. Cater said. "I knew your husband, and I knew what he was like. I knew that what happened in that barn wasn't about you, and I said nothing when people said it was, and that was wrong of me." She stopped. "I'm not asking you to. Forgive me. I just wanted to say it plainly." Eliza thought about what Neshoba had said weeks ago about the soldiers who were ashamed and did it anyway. She thought about the difference between people who chose what was legal over what was right, because the pressure was too great, and people who eventually found the courage to say, I was wrong. It wasn't the same thing. The two failures were not equivalent, but the capacity to say I was wrong, to say it plainly without decoration, without asking for absolution, that was something. That wasn't nothing. Stay and have tea, Eliza said. She wasn't certain it was forgiveness, but it was a door slightly opened into something more human than what had been there before. And she had been living on edges long enough to know that doors, when they appeared, were worth at least stepping toward. Mrs. Cater stayed for an hour. They talked about sort of the garden and the flood and the slow business of rebuilding what the river had taken. When she left, for what it's worth, she touched Eliza's hand briefly at the door, the kind of touch that doesn't need words, and walked back down the road toward town. Eliza stood at the door for a moment, watching her go. The evening was warm. The fireflies were just starting, small cold sparks in the long grass at the edge of the clearing. The river was audible in the distance, low and steady, back to its old voice, the one she had known for 12 years and measured her moods against. She went inside. She lifted the cover from the dish Mrs. Cater had brought and found a corn pudding, still warm, the kind of thing that took most of an afternoon to make. She sat down and looked at it for a moment. Then she served herself a bowl and ate, alone in the lamplight, and thought about all the things that were slowly, in their various ways, beginning to change. The river moved outside, steady as breathing. She thought about Neshoba riding north in the dark, back to his camp along the upper bank. And she thought about his grandmother Nita, who had walked 45 days and nearly made it. And she thought about the stone on the windowsill, the striped river stone she had picked up 12 years ago, and kept because something about it pleased her for no reason more complicated than that. She thought, this is what survival looks like when it becomes something else. When I guess stops being just endurance and starts being actual, ordinary, daily life again. When things stop merely lasting and start meaning. She ate her supper, which she let the fireflies do their small, cold sparking in the dark outside the window. She wasn't afraid of what was coming, which she had been afraid of worse things and come through them. Whatever Hurt was planning, whatever the town decided to do with its opinions, whatever the geography of the future held, she had a friend she trusted and a garden that was growing and a mule who kept walking into the same fence post and emerging undignified but undamaged. There were worse places to begin.